going to go to Julie now, Julie MacArthur, who's a professor based in Canada. You can maybe introduce yourself briefly. And the plan is that each person has, each group has about 10 minutes to talk. And I just want to say, on the basis of the last 2 days, an access 10 minutes feels like about 2 minutes. Time seems to fly, so just bear that in mind. Okay, roughly 10 minutes each, but imagine it to be about a twinkle of your eye. Also, just pop in briefly before Julie goes. Right, over to you, Julie.
Yeah, thanks Patrick. Patrick and I have never met in person, and the value of in person, many of us have been talking about the last couple of days, right? So this is really such a pleasure to be here. I know everyone said it, so it's trite now, but I don't have a toolkit or a framework. I would just like to point that out. But yeah, no, I'm delighted to be here. So my name is Julie MacArthur. I'm a professor, Canada Research Chair in Reimagining Capitalism at a tiny little institution called Royal Roads University. I'll talk about my positionality actually in this talk, so I won't go too much more beyond that here. So the case, a lot of us have been talking about the last couple of days, is case for environmental social science, and Patrick had asked me to be on this panel about international perspectives. But I think there's some real headwinds that some of us have been chatting about, right? Like the defunding of social science and humanities at universities, across the Anglosphere in particular, which is where I focus my attention, but I think it goes well beyond that. So even though we heard this morning there's some policy openness to social science perspectives, I think the broader context is kind of like anti-intellectualism, this anti-intellectual populism, and also the defunding of social science capacities. And certainly that's the case in places that I work. And being redirected towards more narrow ideas of core science. So Aotearoa New Zealand, I was so glad that was mentioned this morning because there's two perspectives I'm going to speak to. One is a Canadian with some lessons from Aotearoa as well. And I think they've gone the furthest in some respects. They essentially scrapped dedicated national funding for social sciences entirely through the scrapping of the Marsden Fund under the auspices that if you want to do that research, it has to have a direct economic benefit, right? So you cannot get like central government funding for social science research. So, but the questions that social scientists ask can address the foundations of our societies and institutions. Questions that we just heard about around who governs, who benefits, whose knowledge counts. And those questions aren't peripheral at all. They're so central to environmental policy. They're what makes environmental policy legible, legitimate, and workable in the first place. So I'm a settler woman in Canada, as I was in New Zealand. I'm not Indigenous. I'm a mother of 3. I live and work, however, on the unceded territories, and this matters in Canadian context, of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations and their ancestors. On the southern tip of Vancouver Island, which is about the size of Taiwan, about 40% of the size of Ireland, for context, for a UK audience. So it's not that tiny, it's hanging off in the Pacific Ocean. But before that positionality, I spent nearly a decade in Tamaki Makaurau, which is Auckland, at the University of Auckland, on the lands of Ngāti Whātua there. And I spent some of my earliest years in Niuayant, which is now Gitlak-Damets, which is Nisga'a territory, which is another kind of, one of the very first modern treaty nations in British Columbia. And this matters because a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how unsettled territory and ownership of territory is and how central that is to environmental policy understandings. And for me, this is like a really big lesson from these two countries I want to speak to as a settler. And this is a really tense position. So settler, white academics trying to learn from, integrate without co-opting, without storytelling for Indigenous peoples is a really uncomfortable, unsettling position to be in. So I really appreciated the kind of provocative questions from this morning's ACI panel, right? About how do you do this work, how do you do it effectively, and how unsettling it actually can be as a settler. And I also think I want to trouble a little bit this idea of the national perspective at all. And I think social science helps us do that a little bit. Like the very category of national perspectives presupposes that the nation is a coherent and settled unit of analysis, which I think we heard again this morning. It isn't necessarily, certainly in the places that I've lived and worked the past 2 decades. So they're actively contested categories of ownership and land in these nations, and I think that's really important. And it's not just a political complication for policymakers, it shapes what governance is possible, what consent looks like, and whose knowledge about land and the environment carries institutional weight. So some colleagues, Emily Eaton and Angela Luke, recently published a book called The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada, right? And they're really pushing on this idea that the idea of Canada as a nation in itself is problematic. We heard reference to Turtle Island earlier, so even the language is shifting, and I think there's a lot that's attached to these different languages and the names that things cause. So even speaking about First Nations in Canada, there are more than 600. Indigenous languages in British Columbia, there are more than 40 of them. So there is no unified Indigenous in Canada, even when I try to speak about those stories and perspectives from a settler perspective. I think that's really important. But Angela and Emily and their colleagues, their point is Indigenous sovereignty is climate action, and it's not a consideration to be added to climate action. And so here, the political economy, ownership, sovereignty, this is all social science, bread and butter essentially, and it's fundamental to any sort of energy transition. I think another point I wanted to make about Canada, I'm so conscious of the time, just like ticking away. In 2025 in British Columbia, where I live, the Supreme Court ruled on what's called the Cowichan Tribes decision. And the Cowichan Tribes has like reverberated through Canada, maybe beyond, I'm not sure, but it's the first time in Canadian history that Aboriginal title has been established over lands that include private fee simple ownership interest. Now the right has gone fairly crazy with this, but it's the idea that the Supreme Court is saying that Aboriginal title that was unceded can now be superimposed on fee simple private land. Doesn't mean that the landowners and people who are in homes on that land have immediately lost it. It's much more complex than that. But this is again troubling that I think a lot of the fundamental environmental policy and essentially a lot of the energy transition scholarship I work in, the presumption is private ownership is a fundamental part of that. This is the avenue through which we're rolling out the transition. And in settler colonial context, that's certainly not always the case, and this tends to get worked through the courts. So the province of BC has challenged this, right? They've appealed it, but it's a really interesting thing to be watching. I wanted to highlight for you guys. But when I offer international perspectives, I'm offering them from particular places whose boundaries, governance arrangements, and relationships are being renegotiated. And that complexity is where I think a lot of our value lives as well, right? You were saying it's political and problematic, and I think that's why it's not very convenient for policymakers necessarily to engage with. A couple other points I want to make about Canada in particular. Climate progress has generally stalled. Many of you from the UK might be familiar with our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who used to be the Governor of the Bank of England. There are some complexities around that, but essentially some of the setbacks in Canada include repeal of a consumer carbon tax, delays to EV policies, weakened industrial carbon pricing, expansion of liquefied natural gas production, and this risks locking in emissions-intensive growth for years to come. So Canada also is not just a laggard on emissions reduction. This is my pitch for why someone should care about Canada. But it is one of the 10 countries in the world with more than 10 existing or planned fossil fuel projects above or 1 gigaton of CO2, the carbon bombs, right? So Canada is a carbon bomb heavy country, and we have the second highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the OECD after Australia. So there's a gap between the reality. Am I 10 minutes already?
Soonish, very soon.
Soonish.
I've got February starts.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to make 2 more points, right? I'll make one more about Canada and one about Australia that I think, or New Zealand that I think is important. One as well that I think social scientists speak to very well is with the election of Donald Trump, this upended and really disturbed the political coalitions in Canada. The Liberal Party in Canada, which was trailing 26 points in the polls, after Trump came in with the tariff threats and annexation threats to turn Canada into the 51st state, Carney ended up winning the election from coming that far behind. An election based on the idea of resource mega projects to secure the sovereignty, the economic stability, putting at stake, and in contradiction with a lot of climate action and climate progress. So this is the geopolitics side that is really kind of fairly challenging. And one little story I wanted to tell about, there's a lot to say about the Aotearoa New Zealand context with respect to the treaty, the different interpretations of the treaty, the different languages and translations, which have different ideas about what value in nature is. But a former colleague of mine, Dan Hikaroa, from the University of Auckland, tells this really fascinating story about how Maori knowledge about taniwha, or monsters, water monsters kind of thing, were actually encoded stories about flood risk. And encoded stories that were passed down historically around also earthquake and landslide risk. And so in this way, Maori scholars are doing an amazing job at articulating how Indigenous epistemologies are directly related to not a replacement for, but in conjunction at the same kind of level of specificity and detail. So he has a lot of, for folks interested in this, I'm happy to recommend some of his work because it's brilliant. The way he tells these stories, Puraku or stories are not just myths, they are science, right? They're important science that should really kind of highlight our policy making. I wanted to talk about wildfires, I wanted to talk about energy transitions, anyhow. I guess I want to leave you with this idea that Canada and Aotearoa teaches a few really important things about social science and environmental policy. Knowledge matters. It's not just scientific knowledge narrowly defined. The Taniwha includes flood risk, but Cowichan never surrendered their title. In each case, certain knowledge and certain actors from the frame, they don't just produce injustice, they produce worse policy. And I also want to trouble this idea that private property is not the natural pre-political foundation of governance. I think that's a major contribution social science research can make to environmental policy, right? To rethink our ownership systems in the way we actually not just value nature, but kind of roll out a transition so it doesn't leave so many people behind that, that there's no legitimacy for it anymore. And I think we're in real danger of that. Thank you.
I guess if you like what you've heard from Judy, if you'd like to read more of her work, there's probably stuff on the internet they can find
There's
with
some
your name
stuff,
on.
yeah.
You've written a few papers,
I have,
maybe
yeah.
the odd book or two.
Yeah.
Okay, so go looking, you can see who she is.
You can come talk to me too.
Yeah. Consider in reality, we've met for the first time, which is wonderful. Right, thank you very much. Onward quickly to Saurabh, please. Would you mind going next? And as I was saying, the 10-minute access slot feels like about 60 seconds. So if you just bear that in mind, time flies.
Yeah, thank you.
Over to you.
Pleasure to be here, everyone. And I've, of course, enjoyed the last 2 days, last 1.5 days that I've been here. I will keep it quick. I can see that people are a bit sleepy and tired. I was too, and I was on the other side. I'm just trying to keep my eyes awake and speak to you guys now. And sadly, I am actually going to talk about something quite conceptual. So the plan originally was that I'll talk about a context and tell a story, maybe an allegory with some profound sort of important implications behind it, but sadly that's not going to happen. I did wonder, maybe I should perhaps talk about South Asia, this international context that I grew up there, of course a lot of shit is flying around, why don't I talk about South Asia? But then I decided not to do that in the end. I also thought about talking about Palestine. I've just done a paper on the genocide in Gaza, and I thought it was important to bring that conversation here, and we have to bring it in every room. I find it so important. Again, I'm not going to do that. I also wondered whether I should talk about the UK. I know, I live here, I call this place home now for the last 12.5 years. And as you know, a racist pogrom was just unleashed on the people of Belfast. Migrant workers, asylum seekers. To be, again, confronting, bringing those issues into the room. But again, I won't say anything else about it. Now, given the very little time I have instead chosen to ask a question and offer a proposal. I do want to make sense of what's going on in the world, like all of us do, as social scientists and so on. And of course, also connect, I feel. It's really, really important to not treat these 3 or 4 stories that I've told at the beginning of extreme violence in India is just horrific right now with the Hindu nationalists in power. They're just redefining the country entirely. So how do we make sense of the current moment? How do we connect across? And also, of course, connect not just for the purpose of connecting, but to confront. It is a moment of resistance again, to come together, to organize, to mobilize, and to theorize, to decolonize. So I thought, okay, well, at the same time, I have to talk about climate disruptions as well, I'm sitting with these people here. And lots of those are also being engendered in the name of low carbon and green transitions and transformations around the world. Some people this morning showed critical minerals and so on and so forth. So those need to be taken into account as well. So how do we bring it together? And critical scholars, of course, in environmental social sciences have made numerous attempts to do that. They've highlighted, for example, I'm sure some of you love that concept, as many critical social scientists in the environmental arena do, the Anthropocene. So I thought, well, we start with the Anthropocene. And of course, it sounds fantastic. Of course, geologists first talked about it 20 years ago, so why shouldn't we? After all, we can be like the natural scientists too. So some of you might remember, there was actually quite a dispute among the geologists back in that early years of 2003-4. Some of the people, the quaternary that actually called it the Anthropocene, others said, how can you call this the Anthropocene? I mean, this is just, what, 200 years? Some of you saying 50 years. Look at the Holocene. There's no way you can call it a geological epoch. But nevertheless, they went ahead, and more than them, we went ahead with it. Ignoring the fact that we're supposed to look at political issues, and this completely depoliticizes the Anthropos. It takes away all difference. All of Anthropos is controlling the planet, has become a geological force destroying the planet. Is it really true? Are all of us really destroying the planet? That's just a complete fallacy to unify humanity in that form. So I thought, okay, no, I'm not going to work with that. So then I thought, okay, well, what about capitalism? And you just mentioned it too. And obviously, it is a globally dominant political formation. It makes sense to talk about it, all the sense in the world. And then I thought about Palestine. And then I thought, well, in the face of genocidal violence, colonial genocidal violence, does capitalism really allow me to understand what is going on in Palestine when states are unleashing that violence without being pushed by capital per se? States themselves are recruiting capitalist enterprises to unleash that violence with the use of AI, with Google technologies, all of that shit that flew down in Gaza. So I rejected that as well. And I thought, okay, well, what about racial capitalism? That does some good job. But then I went to India again. I thought, racial capitalism, how does that make sense in India? We're not really suffering from particular forms of racism. What's happening here is caste. What's happening here is Islamophobia. What's happening here is divide and rule of a very colonial kind on the basis of religion. So I had to leave racial capitalism sadly behind too. Western imperialism is the next one I went to, which looked really good actually. I must say, some of the work in this is excellent. And again, there the issue became, well, it's not a metropole in the West that is driving the violence, for example, by itself in India or even in Palestine. Yeah, so something else is going on. There are sectarian nationalists, for example, everywhere these days, in all parts of the world, doing it pretty much on their own. They don't need to be spurred on by the West anymore to go inflict violence on their peoples. So then, my co-authors and I got together, and I thought, had a discussion around it. What do we propose? So we came up with this alternative concept of colonial modernity. Published a few pieces on it by now, and it's out there. To make sense of this sort of globally hegemonic political formation that continues to inflict much violence and injustice, also in the name of green transitions and transformations, while also obviously furthering the concentration of power and privilege, and not just power, but power, privilege, and patronage in certain quarters of the world. Now, of course, all of you have come across the concept of modernity. Eurocentric conceptions celebrate it. After all, it delivered rationality, it delivered modern bureaucracy, it delivered the roads. I mean, come on, how are the trains? How can you be against, modernity? It is, after all, the way in which the world also defeated colonialism. That's how the modern, traditional Eurocentric conception is presented to us. But what that hides, and this is where the Latin American work on coloniality comes in over the last 2-3 decades that they've been doing, showing that that understanding of modernity, that Eurocentric understanding of it, is completely obscuring its colonial constitution. This is not a colonial sacrifice zone. This is not a colonial externality. This is a colonial heart of the modern world. So to do justice to that, we said perhaps the word term to define today for the world in which we live, all of us live, in different ways, of course, paying attention to the differences between different contexts, very, very important, being very respectful to those differences. And luckily, post-colonial studies had already done that job with the concept of alternative modernities back in 2001. So we went with colonial modernity to describe what's going on in the world. And we came up with 6, actually now 9, or somebody might say 15, different dimensions to think about colonial modernity. And I'll just talk about the 6 that we wrote about in 2023, 3 years ago now, and if I'm allowed the time.
3 minutes to talk about, what is it, 6 or 15?
That's more than enough. 6 is more than enough.
Go for it.
So the first of these are all interwoven dimensions, so I must say that already, and we are working also with textiles nowadays to think about how do we think about the interweaving. Weaves, knots, felt, all these different ways of thinking about the ways in which these different dimensions are interwoven with each other. So the first one is assumptions of comprehensive superiority around race, around nation, around religion, but also around ways of knowing. Very important. How science, modern science, is imposed as the only objective way of knowing in the world. Second, appropriation of cultural privileges. Of course, privileges of all kinds, not just economic. All kinds of cultural privileges, knowledges, wisdoms, all kinds of things, rhythms, recipes, yoga. All kinds of things have been appropriated and concentrated in certain parts of the world. So that, appropriation of cultural privileges, enforcement of gendered dominations. Now here a certain modern definition of gendered domination is imposed. Because I'm not saying there were no patriarchies in other parts of the world, of course there were, but they were different. And in many cases they were also already quite well developed skills, tools to resist those forms of patriarchy too. But modern definitions of gender were imposed. The work of Maria Lugones and many others has highlighted that. The fourth, very, very important in the current context, assertions of military supremacy. I don't think we can make sense of the modern world without thinking about those and how those are inflicted on racial, national, and so on, those lines. Fifth, extensions of controlling imaginations which are embedded deeply inside some of our technologies, such as climate geoengineering, synthetic biology, genetic modification, etc., etc. That list is really, really long. And finally, the sixth one, but not, last but not the least, the expansion of toxic extractions, which leave huge toxic trails behind. Critical minerals just being some of them. Lithium, you name it, all of that's happening again in the name of green, whatever. So I've got, of course, decolonial implications of each of these different ways of thinking, 6 of them, and a weave of that as well. But I'll leave that. If there are questions, I can talk about that, or for another day. So it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's starting to feel like around the world in 80 days. We're now going to proceed 2 feet to the left and a fairly large area into Taiwan. So thank you so much for 2 of our guest speakers from Taiwan today. So would you like to take about 10 minutes, and noting that it feels about 1 or 2 minutes, to present some ideas and share. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. And I'm Hsing-Sheng from the Twins delegation Taiwan. And my colleague John and other colleagues are there. And firstly, thank you so much for the invitation of Access and Professor Wright, so that we got a chance to be here. Today, I would like to introduce very briefly the Environmental Social Science in Taiwan, TWINS. TWINS stands for Taiwan Interdisciplinary Net Zero Social Science Research, which is funded by the National Science and Technology Council, Taiwan. Okay, yeah. Now I will just very quickly show how the TWINS community grows. So in the last years, we can see that the network connects government, scholars, and also civil society, like environmental groups. And then now we have 16 research projects involve more than 30 universities, and research teams are involved. So, and today, thanks to the effort of Lynn, as you know her very well, we got the chance to be here and to connect to Access. Oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Okay, so TWINS is quite a unique experiment in Taiwan, in the sense that it is designed for pursuing transdisciplinary research for social transformation and promoting active science policy interactions. All the research projects are requested to work together with diverse stakeholders, including civil society groups, government sectors, and private sectors. And also, the research findings and policy suggestions are requested to co-produced by stakeholders. In this way, we would like to offer more actionable solutions than conventional ones, and also with solid, rigorous research base. Okay. And while the twins is quite exceptional in Taiwan, let's go back to the norm and look at the environmental social science in Taiwan in general. Generally speaking, the academia, government, and civil society are very loosely connected in Taiwan, and individual scholars exert their influence on policies through informal channels like advisory roles, personal networks, and temporary positions. And there's only very limited long-term enduring science policy mechanisms. And this is partly rooted in the research culture of social science in Taiwan. Namely, most scholars and research projects, they are individual-based without large team collaboration. And there is only very limited integration between social science and natural science, and even among individual social scientific disciplines. Also, most of the scholars, they don't care too much about policy relevance of their research findings. So this can primarily attributed to Taiwan's culture. Taiwan is a very technology and industry-oriented culture, so that social science often enters after technical economic decisions have been made. In general, the role of social science is recognized, but it's often very narrowly defined. So let me take one example. Every time when I met the CCS team, scientific team of Taiwan, they always told me that happy to see you, and finally you are here. We need your help because we have no idea how to address the community engagement issues. So that's a typical attitude toward social science, that social science is being treated as end of the pipe technique or measures. And as we all here, we agree, the social science should play a broader role, a more central role from the very beginning, from problem framing, humanities and value reflection, socioeconomic and cultural structure, institutions and governance, justice, accountability, and legitimacy, and more.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Also, Taiwan has a quite unique context. Taiwan is an island, only a little bit larger than Wales, with a total population of 23 million people. And more than 60% of the land are covered by mountains and forests. And that leads to very heated debate about land use policy during the net zero transitions. Taiwan also stands as the center of global IC and AI hardware supply chains. So Taiwan produces more than 90% of leading-edge chips. The whole supply chain's energy demand is rapidly growing. So, for example, the IC tech giant TSMC alone is expected to consume up to 50%. I'm sorry, this figure is wrong. It should be 15% of the total energy the total electricity by 2030. At the same time, almost every major country around the world is very concerned about the geopolitical tensions between Taiwan and Strait. But Taiwan imports 95% of the total energy demand, and we only produce about 40% of renewable energies by ourselves. So all these issues pose a huge challenge to Taiwan's net zero transition, and also the industrial policy, national security policy, and energy security policy. So in the last years, we have learned some lessons. Taiwan is a democratic country with vibrant civil society. Taiwan is also a colonial country that exploited indigenous rights for a very long time. Almost half of the land area has been claimed as indigenous traditional territory. However, the issues like whether it's about indigenous or non-indigenous society, issues like place attachment and identity, natural resources and land rights, participation, consultation, and justice have never been and should be adequately addressed. So Taiwan also shows that net zero transition is also about geopolitics, national security, energy security, and resilience. So we have to move social science upstream before pathways are fixed, and we have to build strong science policy interfaces for democratic and just transitions. In sum, we need more social science and more social scientists, and that's why we are here. Thank you so much.